to do something similar for all of you. And so thank you all for joining today. Let's go ahead and start with just doing a couple of prayers. I think today it would be nice, since we're working with this whole idea of all beings in this world and trying to create the best environment for all of them, that we think about the mental environment for all these beings by cultivating these 4 immeasurable thoughts, and then we'll feed this into the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. But visualize around you all sentient beings, particularly the beings of this world, that we share this environment with. And as we cultivate each of these thoughts, try to send it out to every single being without exception. We obviously have some beings in this world that we find very difficult to work with, but do your best to cultivate these intentions towards each and every one. So let's begin with the thought, the first line. We'll recite it together, and then we'll just pause and meditate on it briefly. The first one is immeasurable love, or loving kindness, where we generate the wish for all beings to find a true state of peace and happiness. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. So again, really feel your own heart expand to include all these beings with that sincere wish, filled with love, filled with kindness towards all. And then the companion thought of compassion, where we look at the suffering of beings. Every single being that we're visualizing is dealing with some level of suffering, dissatisfaction, not having developed themselves completely. And so we're going to generate the wish for all beings to be free from those forms of suffering and all the causes that lead to that. And so again, feel your heart expand to include each and every being as much as possible. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And then the third thought, which is immeasurable joy, thinking about this having been accomplished, all beings in a state of true happiness, free from suffering, and share in the joy that all these beings are experiencing, and cultivate a joyful heart yourself with kind of that awareness of that possibility. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. And then finally, the fourth immeasurable thought. Sometimes it's presented first because it is such a foundational thought, but nonetheless, all 4 of these are so important in terms of opening our heart to the entire world. Here, we're wishing for all beings to be free from bias and partiality, so that they can embrace others with an even mind, this mind of equanimity. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then on the screen now, we'll do the prayer on the right-hand side, taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. Again, the first 2 lines, bringing to mind whatever sense of safe direction you already have with regard to the Buddha's teachings in particular, as well as the Buddha as a guide, the Sangha, the Supreme Assembly, as those who can help you on this path. They have greater realization, so they can be a true sense of support. Whatever level of kind of confidence you have in the 3 jewels, bring that to mind in those first 2 lines. In the second 2 lines, bring to mind the motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to engage in today's session with that most far-reaching attitude that is fueled by those 4 immeasurable thoughts, that has this outstanding altruistic wish to benefit all sentient beings by becoming a Buddha ourselves. So let's recite this once in the English and twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chenyen gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chenyen gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, let's do a short meditation before we begin the class. Just give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and to generate this motivation of bodhicitta a little more deeply. And just again, settle into a good meditation posture, one that is suitable for your body. Then also can begin to pay attention to the breath or whatever object you'd like to work with during this initial meditation. For most people, the breath is a good object to work with because it's with us all the time. Just begin to work with the breath in whatever way you tend to. And if you need a suggestion, I generally suggest working with this area around the nostrils where we feel the air coming in and out when we inhale and exhale. Just making that your focal point and trying to stay present with that sensation, not wandering around, going out with the out breath and, getting distracted internally or what have you. Just trying to stay present as best as you can with that sensation right in that area. But no doubt the mind will wander at times. And when it does, and we see that that's happened, we simply acknowledge that, let that distraction go, and return to the breath or whatever object we're working with. So I'll ring the chime to begin a short meditation period in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for today. So now let's set our motivation together. And because today's topic is about our environment and an ecological responsibility for the environment, I think it's good to just each of us take stock of our own contribution to ecology in this world right now. Every one of us, I'm sure, has done something in terms of moving in that direction. And just feel good that you have that awareness and that you are taking responsibility to the degree that you are. This is often where it starts, is sort of acknowledging the work that we have done, what we currently do that contributes to better results for both ourselves and others in this world. And then also to, on top of this, generate a motivation for being here to continue to deepen your own commitment to being a steward for the earth, all the beings in it, continuing to do this work to learn more about how to work with your own mind, as well as your physical and verbal actions, everything that follows, so that you can continue to contribute and contribute in even greater ways to the welfare of all beings in this world. And of course, in this Mahayana tradition, how we ideally work for the benefit of all beings is by having this motivation of bodhicitta, this desire to take whatever it is that we're working with, whether it be a formal Buddhist practice, reading Buddhist texts, or talking about the environment, that all of this can be used with this motivation that desires to develop ourselves completely so we can then help others to do that same work. So everything we do can be couched within this motivation of bodhicitta. So cultivate that mind very deeply in your heart right now so that we do set our intentions on the greatest goal and the greatest benefit for both ourselves and all sentient beings. Okay, so again, welcome to this talk, Ecology and the Human Heart. As I mentioned before we started, this is something that I've tried to talk on occasionally, and usually around Earth Day we try to have something here in Santa Fe where I'll take this lecture and maybe accentuate certain parts of it. Even the last time we did this, we didn't do this year for Earth Day because we had Venerable Rabina visiting around that time, and we were, of course, in shut down at that point and doing everything online, and so it just didn't happen. But the year before, in 2019, I also had a little bit of a report from our own state legislature in terms of what was going on around the environment here and what have you. So I think it's good for us, again, to, as Buddhists, to work with this topic very much and to continue to have some awareness of it. There are so many books out that are Buddhist oriented around the environment. I haven't read them all. Today I'll be citing a few things that I found here and there that I think are inspiring for us to hear and to pay attention to. One of the books that I'll draw from a little bit later is this wonderful book that I found several years ago. I don't even remember when this first came out, 2012. So it's getting to be an older book, but it's nonetheless still quite relevant, called Active Hope. It's by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston. And there's a lot of beautiful ideas in this. And Joanna Macy herself is Tibetan Buddhist. And so she approaches everything from that Buddhist perspective. So I'm hoping that some of what I can share, some of their wisdom and some discussion of that and opening up our minds to different ideas will help you to, again, continue to do the work. It's been interesting being in this period now where we're dealing with coronavirus and the shutdown of so many parts of the world. And, those people who were naysayers, who didn't believe that humankind is having an effect on the environment through climate change and what have you, we can see that everything is changing without all of the cars out on the road, without all the planes in the sky, without all of the normal hustle and bustle that's going on. We've seen changes in the environment. and even the animals, dolphins in the canals in Venice and all these sorts of things you hear about. The animals are having a picnic. They think it's great that the human beings are all in their homes and staying away from things. So it is interesting to see that, all of this is evidence that we are having an impact on our world. And so there's even greater need in terms of what we're seeing and what's going on now to make sure that we take every opportunity to continue to do this deeper work, not just the spiritual work that Buddhism is about, but even the work in our world. It can have a greater impact on the temporal well-being of others, and certainly then on the long-term benefit for others. So let me go ahead and get the little slideshow started that I put together for today. There will be an opportunity a little bit later to ask some questions, but if you do have questions that come up during the lecture, by all means, feel free to put those in the chat box if you are afraid you might forget them. And then when I do the questions towards the end, I'll come to the chat box first and see what's there. So I'm starting off with a little quote from His Holiness. Of course, His Holiness has become an amazing advocate for the environment. A little talk he gave called Universal Responsibility in the Environment. He says, our ancestors viewed the earth as rich and bountiful, which it is. Many people in the past also saw nature as inexhaustibly sustainable, which we now know is the case only if we care for it. So we are in this world that we're blessed with, everything we need, essentially, all of the minerals and, the ability to grow crops and the water, everything. It is all here. But of course, we have to care for it because it's not inexhaustible, and it's not something that will take care of itself in the face of human intervention. The world is a pretty amazing organism, but nonetheless, it does require some care. So I thought I would share, as I did in last year when I did this talk, where we're at now. This comes from NASA's website on the climate. Carbon dioxide is 414 parts per million, and just so you have an idea of what that means, carbon dioxide levels in the air are at their highest level in 650 million years, based on what they've been able to analyze through soil and rocks and what have you. This is a pretty serious issue. Global temperature. Of course, this is initially a lot of this was called global warming because of this phenomenon that in general, when we take the temperature of the world at large, we are finding that things are going up. We are up 2 degrees since 1880, which you might not think is so much, but nonetheless, it has happened exponentially in these last 20 years or so. As it says there, 19 of the 20 warmest years on record have occurred since 2001. So a bit scary when we think about, how much we've seen that in our own recent past, things continuing to warm up. Arctic ice minimum, it's down 12.85% per decade. In 2012, Arctic summer sea ice shrank to the lowest extent on record. Of course, we know that these polar ice caps, them melting is a big indicator of what's happening in terms of the warmth of this planet and the ability for us to continue to have an environment that's favorable for all the beings in it. The ice sheet itself is down 426 gigatons per year, and satellite data shows that Earth's polar ice sheets are losing mass. So again, not so pleasant. We got a bit of a bleak outlook here. One more statistic, sea level. Sea level is up 3.3 milliliters per year. The global average sea level has risen nearly 7 inches over the past 100 years. And of course, again, it's doing it much more exponentially now. And this is where we have been seeing a lot of impact on human beings, people who live in coastal towns and so on. Even in Florida, people are seeing this in terms of having an effect on the environment. In a film that Leonardo DiCaprio was behind before the flood, they actually had a little interview with the mayor of Miami Beach and showing it how in Miami Beach they had to do these various things to get the sea level was rising so much that they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to be dealing with regular flooding and what have you. So we know that these are problems. We know that all these statistics are not pointing in the right direction. Even though we've got this little respite, this break with having COVID-19 in our world, things are not so great. So what role can Buddhism, and specifically we as Buddhist practitioners, play in confronting this unprecedented crisis? Well, Let's go to His Holiness again. A different talk he gave, because he's given so many on the environment. This one was called A Buddhist Concept of Nature. He says, since negligence of the environment, which has resulted in lots of harm to the human community, came about by ignorance of the very special importance of the environment, I think it is very important, first of all, to instill this knowledge within human beings. So this is what we're going to first look at, is kind of how we need to increase our awareness and our knowledge of the environment, but moreover, the connectedness of everything and the reality of how Buddhism teaches the concepts that are really useful for us to work with this. So Thich Nhat Hanh, in a beautiful book called Love Letter to the Earth that he wrote a number of years ago, he says, if we think about the earth as just the environment around us, we experience ourselves and the earth as separate entities. We may see the planet only in terms of what it can do for us. We need to recognize that the planet and the people on it are ultimately one and the same. And there was that concept of Gaia, kind of this, looking at everything as one huge organism, one huge thing going on. And of course, we lost a bit of the awareness of that. One television show that I found really instrumental in increasing my awareness of this whole connectedness of things that you might find useful to watch if you hadn't seen it already, was on National Geographic, and it was called One Strange Rock, and it was hosted by Will Smith, but it involved 9 different astronauts who had all spent time up in the space station looking down on Earth and watching it from that macro level of what was all going on. And of course, then each episode works with something at a more detailed level of what's exactly happening. Like there were those dust storms that were coming from Africa, and those are a vital part of what happens in terms of carrying various nutrients that feed sea creatures that produce, all of the various substances. I mean, everything is connected. There's nothing that is kind of happening on this planet that is totally removed from everything else. So we have to gain this appreciation for we as the beings in this world, and of course all the other beings we share this with, are also part and parcel of that. We need to not see it as totally separate, that there's the world that we live in and then we as the beings that live there. Rather, it is all interconnected. And of course, this is big Buddhist teachings that most of you have heard before, that interdependence and what have you. And so that is, what this slide says after the Thich Nhat Hanh quote. Essentially, this is pointing to the concept of interdependence, which is one of the primary Buddhist teachings upon which we rely. The fact that everything depends upon factors outside of itself. Nothing is totally standing on its own, solitary, independent. Rather, everything is interdependent. His Holiness says interdependence, of course, is a fundamental law of nature. Not only myriad forms of life, but the subtlest level of material phenomena as well are governed by interdependence. So when we have an effect on one thing, it obviously doesn't just stay in that quadrant, that area. It has an effect on something else because of this interdependence. This is why we're seeing, again, the effects of what humankind has been doing in this world, having a detrimental effect on the environment, that having a detrimental effect on the other species on this planet, and so on. Things are all connected. All phenomena from the planet we inhabit to the oceans, clouds, forests, and flowers that surround us arise in dependence upon subtle patterns of energy. And those, are staying in balance to some degree, but they can be taken out of balance very, very quickly. Without their proper interaction, they dissolve and decay. We need to appreciate this fact of nature far more than we have in the past. Our ignorance of it is directly responsible for many of the problems we face. So I think His Holiness, is primarily, pointing out here this idea of sort of the external factors that are involved in interdependence. And, that is an important thing to be aware of. As I said, if what we're doing through our actions, through use of cars and flying planes and all the various stuff that's going on in this world is having a detrimental effect on the environment around us, we need to understand the cause and effect of that. That's why climate science is so important for people to become aware of and to understand and to know how their own actions are then contributing to that or helping to, avert that. So these external causes and conditions in terms of interdependence are really important for us to know. But in Buddhism, this deeper investigation into interdependence also finds that we affect the outer environment through the inner environment. And of course, this is the wisdom that I think Buddhism has to offer that is a bit unique, is the idea that, we are the creators of our world through our own minds, through our inner environment. And so thus we need to understand the deeper role that our minds play in creating the causes for what we are experiencing in our environment. To get that there is something more going on than just the cause and effect that we see in the world around us. Yes, respect the cause and effect that we see in the world around us, without a doubt. His Holiness is very adamant about how we need to pay attention to the science to make sure that we are following the proper instructions in terms of how to avert greater disaster in this world. But in Buddhism, we also have to understand that our minds are involved in creating all of this. So this is where I want to just remind people of the core teachings, the Four Noble Truths that are behind all of Buddhism. These are the schema that the Buddha used to describe our situation, and it is relevant at any time in the history of this world or any world, is that we are involved, first of all, in the truth of dukkha. The Buddha saw in his own wisdom that we are dealing with dukkha, which is a Sanskrit word that essentially means dissatisfaction. That we are not dealing with things being quite right. There's always something that is off. And this, of course, can be seen in terms of the suffering we experience at a coarser level. What's going on in the world now around COVID-19 is obviously evidence of the nature of dukkha. That this isn't such a great place to be. But those who don't have COVID-19, who aren't dealing with it directly in their family or friends or what have you, might think, well, but I'm not suffering, everything's fine. Well, that's because they're not looking deeply enough, not coming to the conclusion that even when we have things that are going well for us, those too are unsatisfactory. They don't ultimately do the trick. They're transitory. They are incapable of fulfilling our deepest desires. And that's because we're in a sort of flawed existence. Now, again, one of the problems that even in some Buddhist literature, they point out that does happen even in the Christian tradition, when people look at this world and they kind of see the faults of this world, that they think that then, well, this world isn't to be embraced so much because there's something beyond this world. In the Christian tradition, there's, of course, the afterlife and going to heaven to meet one's maker, to be with Jesus and what have you, all of that. And it's a perfectly fine goal for people to have, but that shouldn't lead Christians to neglect the world that they live in, and I don't think it does for many of them. But nonetheless, this can be a fault. And in Buddhism, we have the same potential problem. When we look at this world and we see that it's kind of created through the force of these contaminated causes and conditions, that it's unsatisfactory or faulty, we might think, well, then I don't need to do so much with this world because I want to transcend this world. I want to get beyond this world. And of course, this is what the Four Noble Truths go on to tell us. And the second truth, the truth of the causes of our dukkha, the Buddha says, yes, everything is within your own mind. Through the force of your delusions, especially your ignorance, you are creating the causes for your own in unsatisfactory experience. So again, it's totally understandable then that we could look at that and feel like, oh, well, this is a faulty world that I want to abandon. And the Buddha, of course, when the last two truths went on to teach that we can actually do that. We can have an end to our suffering once and for all, an end to dukkha. We don't have to experience this state of dissatisfaction, but we have to practice the causes for that. That's the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path that leads to the end of dukkha. Again, but we have to make sure we interpret these correctly. This doesn't mean that we should devalue in any way the world that we are a part of, that we have created. This existence is the very stuff from which we can awaken all of our qualities and develop all of our potential. Recall that one of the most powerful analogies for this idea of transcending all of this is the lotus. The lotus, of course, blooms in a pond and kind of rises up above the water and has this beautiful flower that is unsullied by any of the mud, because lotuses grow in the muckiest parts of the pond. They need that mud and muck in order to fully develop. It's the same with regard to our own spiritual development. The world that we live in, as flawed as it is, as faulty as it is, as much as we will never be able to perfect the world outside that is this conditioned existence, we still need to pay attention to it. We still need to be respectful of it, because it's the very stuff from which we are here, which we are able to grow, with which we are able to connect to others, and so on. So I think this is an important, point to make at this juncture, is just to recognize that when we hear Buddha's teachings and we get this promise of attaining nirvana or enlightenment, kind of going beyond this world, that shouldn't mean that we let go of any importance we place on this world and tending to it. In fact, it's just the opposite, and particularly in the Mahayana tradition, where we recognize that there are so many beings that depend upon this world. Just their temporal well-being depends upon resources being here, oxygen being here, carbon dioxide being here in right levels, and what have you. All of this, depends upon the actions that we take. So again, although we go into the Buddhist teachings of the Four Noble Truths, it's not to, hold out that idea that, oh, if only we could transcend all this nonsense and be away from this world. Any spiritual tradition that kind of teaches that, it can be misunderstood. We still do have to tend to the world we live in. So, as I was saying in my just little brief talking about the Four Noble Truths, dukkha, the first noble truth, arises from its causes, which are contaminated karma. Contaminated karma arises from the delusions. The root delusion is ignorance, specifically not seeing the true nature of reality, especially in regard to the I or person. Each of us is working from this vantage point of this self that we are adhering to in such a strong way. And we aren't really seeing how that self actually exists, because if we were seeing it, we would understand interdependence. We would get that the self actually depends upon so many factors outside of itself. And so again, this is the process by which we are creating this faulty world. But once more, we still can create contaminated karma that leads to positive results within this world. The word contaminated shouldn't be taken to mean that it's all, um, incapable of producing any measure of happiness. Contaminated simply means that it's still together with what's driven us to be in this existence, which is essentially our ignorance. So again, what we're looking at in terms of this idea of interdependence is one of the key teachings that helps us to break free of this illusion of this separate, independent self or I person. So the path to cease dukkha, of course, involves, first of all, generating good morality, being in charge of our minds and our body and speech, kind of doing what we can to make sure that we don't create harm in this world. And of course, in the teachings that we're looking at around working with our environment, this is really important, because once again, as we saw in the karma module that we just finished in Discovering Buddhism, our karma, our actions, are really key in creating what it is that we experience. So again, this is an important thing for us to understand, is that that's the first step, and that's mostly what we're going to be looking at today, obviously, is kind of what do our actions look like on the basis of a response to what's happening in our world ecologically. Then, of course, the Buddhist path goes deeper in terms of the internal work that needs to be done. Developing concentration, calming the delusions to some degree through concentration so that we're not under their control all the time. But we have to combine that concentration with the third training, which is wisdom, which is the uprooting of the ignorance through seeing the grand dependence that things have upon other factors, this overriding truth that is speaking to the reality of things at a much deeper level. So we're going to touch on that to some degree, but essentially, mostly what we're talking about today is kind of how do we change our actions, and of course the thoughts behind those actions, so that we can have an even greater positive influence on the world around us. So I'm quoting here from David Loy, Buddhist practitioner. I think he's a Zen practitioner, and he did a little article called "What Would the Buddha Do?" that was about the environment. I think he's even written a book that's called Eco Dharma. It's on my shelf. I looked over there just a second ago, and yeah, it's there. I haven't read it yet, but he seems like an interesting guy in terms of the way he's approaching this. He says the most distinctive Buddhist teaching is also the one that gives us the most insight into the collective crises confronting us. The relationship between suffering, in the broadest sense, this dukkha, and the delusive sense of a self that feels disconnected from others, that isn't seeing that interdependence. So he says such a self is inherently uncomfortable because it is always insecure, and the ways it often tries to secure itself to feel more real tend to make things worse. And of course, most of you have been around Buddhism know that this is essentially what's going on, is that we're driven by this false sense of a self, and we just get more and more deeply entrenched in that. The way we try to secure ourselves to feel more real tends to make things worse. We're going to kind of look at this idea in terms of how it's playing out in regard to our environment. The essential truth about the individual self is just as revealing about collective selves, which also try to secure themselves by promoting their own group self-interest at the price of other groups. Of course, this is what's happened in our world when we talk about the collective selves that are the first world nations that have taken advantage to a greater degree of the resources that are here on this planet. And we all are a part of that. Each of us might individually be doing something different now in terms of choices we make and how we live our lives so that we are not as involved. But nonetheless, this is what's happened, is that there's been even a collective self that is on the nation of America, or certainly even in the West, the entire developed world, to thinking that we then can use the rest of the world for whatever it is that we need to make our devices, to make our phones and our pads and everything else that is, requiring all these resources to be mined in various parts of the world. And not often being very respectful around how we do that and go about that. So it's because of this delusion, of this clinging to a sense of a distinct self that we need to attend to and take care of, that all of these other ensuing things happen. The environment that we have created through, of course, happening through these various physical actions has been driven by the mental actions, has been driven by our way of looking at things and making decisions on the basis of that, coming from a place of selfishness and self-centeredness. So if a sense of separation is the problem, embracing interdependence must be at the heart of any solution. Interdependence is not merely an insight to be cultivated on our cushions. Of course, this is too what I'm trying to emphasize today, is that a lot of what we talk about in Buddhism is developing the understanding of it, but the understanding of it alone is not going to make a difference in our world. We have to act from that place of interdependence. So a suffering world, he says, calls upon us to realize interdependence, to make it real. What we really mean by realize. How do you realize interdependence? Make it real in the ways we actually live. If Buddhists do not want to do this or cannot find ways to do this, then Buddhism is not the spiritual path that the world needs today. I found that to be an interesting comment, but it really is true. If this is not something we can offer to the world, that we can demonstrate in our own behavior and utilize as our measure for how we are going to go about living our lives, then maybe the world doesn't need our path. So we have to make this real. We have to make interdependence not just a level of understanding, but a way of being. So this is, again, I appreciate David Loy kind of giving some thoughts to that whole idea. So my little summarization of this first part: therefore, we need to have a deep understanding of the interdependence between the environment and the beings within it, as is taught in Buddhism. And this is one of the most valuable teachings of Buddhism. As I mentioned, this is, of course, something we went through to great detail in the Karma module that Venerable Tendrin started, and I did the last half of these last 3 weeks. And in Karma, the teachings on Karma, of course, we come to the understanding that it's through the force of our minds, primarily, that are generating these various thoughts. And if they're selfish and only looking at my needs, they're rooted in that ignorance, and then often have other delusions on top of that. And then I go about my actions on the basis of that. I'm only going to create the cause for my own suffering. I'm not going to be creating the causes ultimately for my happiness, because everything I'm doing is contrary to that. It's denying the reality of interdependence. It's thinking that I can only watch out for me, myself, and I, and everything is going to be fine. This is the biggest lie that humankind has lived with. Of course, not just humankind. All beings have this fundamental flaw of being self-centered and self-grasping, focusing on that and working from that place. But as human beings, we have so much more power to do things negatively from that vantage point. So again, while I'm not denying by any means physically what has happened that has led us to this point in our world and what's going on, but what has been the driving force even behind those physical actions? What has led us to have all the complications that we have in the environment? Primarily, our own states of mind. And of course, our states of mind are creating karma that then cause the world to manifest in these unfavorable ways. Karma is the main agent by which anything happens. That's why, as I mentioned in the Karma module, it's one of the most important teachings of the Buddha, if not the most important teaching of the Buddha, because cause and effect is all around us. His Holiness refers to this as universal causality. Everything is arising from various causes and conditions. We need to be aware of that and see also once more, as I was just pointing out and looking at interdependence, how our minds are involved in that process. We as sentient beings are contributing to the world that we experience by virtue of what we bring to it, our deluded thoughts or our very clear, informed, wise thoughts. So wisdom is a key part of our path, obviously, then. But wisdom alone is not the totality of the path, as many of you know. There's also a need to remember the interdependence that exists between one's own well-being and that of others. And this leads to the other essential element of compassion. And we often talk about how there are two wings of a bird that allow the bird to fly to its destination. Well, we have two wings of our practice in the Mahayana tradition that allow us to get to Buddhahood. Wisdom is one of them, but compassion is the fuel, if you will. It's what kind of keeps everything moving forward, is having that opening up to the well-being of others, being concerned about their suffering, or wanting them to be happy and free from all dissatisfaction. So His Holiness, in regard to this, says, ignorance of interdependence has not only harmed the natural environment, but human society as well. Instead of caring for one another, we place most of our efforts for happiness in pursuing individual material consumption. And again, as we go through this, I'm not trying to, lay some heavy stuff on any of you. Each of us has to hear these words or read these words and think about them in terms of ourselves. And to what degree do we fall prey to those sorts of mindsets? Following after, what I want, what I need, and being blind to the effects that has on the beings around us as well as the environment. We have become so engrossed in this pursuit that without knowing it, we have neglected to foster the most basic human needs of love, kindness, and cooperation. His Holiness says this is very sad. One of the refreshing things, I suppose, about dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and what have you, is to see how human beings have risen to the challenge and are certainly, many of them, doing what is necessary to help to make sure that we get through all of this. That phrase that has become a catchphrase of this entire thing, that we're all in this together, is the truth of it, as we're pointing out in regard to this interdependence. So it does, again, it's important then that we have the right mindsets to approach that we recognize that compassion and care and concern for others is the most favorable thing that we can do. And we can't neglect that in the midst of all of what's going on. Because that's sort of the topic for today is ecology in the human heart. That's really the driving force. You can have all the wisdom in the world, but if you're not motivated through the force of your compassion to want to use that wisdom for the sake of benefiting others, well, then it doesn't really go very far. That wisdom's useful to you, but it's not so useful to anyone else. So again, this is the two wings of the bird that we're looking at here, and His Holiness kind of expounding a bit more on the compassion that is so essential, so much needed. And I found this little quote that I found interesting. This Gus Speth, I don't know who he is. Somebody posted this on Facebook, one of my Facebook friends, maybe one of you, I don't remember. And he's an environmental lawyer. And I found this quote to be really quite powerful. He says, I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. Just like I was saying, having all the wisdom in the world, you can just address them. You can get rid of them, right? But I was wrong, he says. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. People on the scientific end of it are very good at picking it all apart and kind of understanding what's going on, and they can talk to all the various things that are happening that are contributing to climate change and the polar ice caps melting and all of this. They can understand it all from that point of view. But if you don't get to the human heart and understand what's happening deep within beings that's driving them to continue to be self-driven and only care about themselves, be very greedy and apathetic towards others and what have you, and not generate the loving kindness and caring concern for each other, well, then all those solutions aren't going to amount to a hill of beans, because the real problem is within our own minds. The real problem is what we are bringing into the world through the force of those thoughts that then guide our actions, that then cause all of these various consequences. And I think it's really quite interesting, again, in the time that we're in, that this is showing us another window of possibility for us to come out of this entire global experience. This has kind of been interesting. Climate change also, and what's happening with the environment, is a global experience, but it hasn't impacted people in the way that this has. But this can also be a very powerful learning opportunity. And again, the rest of what I'm going to cover today kind of gets into that idea, that wouldn't it be wonderful if we could use this as the opportunity to shift things in a different direction. And that involves a mental shift. As that environmental lawyer was saying, the science is one thing, but if we don't get to human beings and what they're doing, then we're not going to be so effective, not going to be able to really do what is necessary in order to have the more lasting change. So these are, again, my little segues here. If we are to set about achieving external balance, we have to do that through achieving internal balance then. And perhaps this is where Buddhism can contribute a great deal towards resolving the crises we're facing. Therefore, His Holiness says, therefore, in order to achieve more effective results and in order to succeed in the protection of the natural environment, it is also important to bring about internal balance within human beings themselves. So this is what I was alluding to and what I just said, that again, we have to do the work inside. This is what Buddhism has the tools to help us to do. But those tools, again, we have to use. We have to spend time ourselves cultivating that and then acting from that place, as David Loy was saying. And His Holiness says also, I try always to express the value of having a good heart. This simple aspect of human nature can be nourished to great power. With a good heart and wisdom, again, compassion and wisdom, you have right motivation and will automatically do what needs to be done. This teaching on compassion and wisdom is so essential, because we really see that they are everything that's needed. If we have the wisdom and the understanding at the conventional level of how things work in the world, as well as the deeper level of how things are working karmically and what have you, in deeper understanding of reality that the Buddha teaches, well then, together with compassion, we will be infallible to some degree. I'm not saying we won't ever make mistakes, but we'll have the guiding force to do what needs to be done. The wisdom and compassion elements are both quite central to this. So His Holiness goes on, he says, now, on a close examination, the human mind, the human heart, and the environment are inseparably linked together. And I've been saying today, which maybe doesn't need repeating, but I like quoting His Holiness because he is such an advocate, again, for the environment. He says, in this sense, environmental education helps to generate both the understanding and love we need to create the best opportunity there has ever been for peace and lasting coexistence. So again, when we understand all these factors coming together, then we need to embrace environmental education, being aware as an essential part of what will help people to do what needs to be done. So to wrap up this first part, essentially then we rely upon two elements. Our wisdom, which sees clearly the interdependence of all things, that nothing exists independently, and we understand all the factors then that are involved in things arising for good, for bad. And then we have the second element of compassion, which opens the heart to embrace the welfare of all beings within the view of interdependence. And in some ways, these two are not that separate. We talk about them as if there's kind of distinct qualities, but they are very much interrelated, right? If we have the understanding of wisdom, it should contribute to feeding our compassion. And the more we practice the compassion, the more that it embraces the wisdom of interdependence and the understanding that my taking care of others is no different than my taking care of myself. Taking care of the world is no different than taking care of myself or of taking care of others. It's all interconnected. And so if we continue to have this, motivation that sees both the wisdom and compassion aspects as completely complementary, as totally in line with what we need to do, the summation of our path, then we have very powerful tools, things that we can use. But as I'm going to say in the next slide, that may not be enough. We might need some other things to help us. So while wisdom and compassion inform our response to climate change and other problems in our world, the challenges we face can seem insurmountable, and they seem that way almost every day. You hear more statistics, even though, again, we're dealing with a lessening of some of the effects while we're dealing with this pandemic. The world is still in pretty dire, straits. It's still not, by any means, uh, out of this crisis. So he says, so we may need additional tools to keep our hearts open and our intentions strong. So this is where I'm going to be relying upon, to a large degree, what Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston talk about in their book, Active Hope. This is the way that they're approaching this. Now, I know there is this word hope that has become a bit of a dirty word or something. I don't know. I found it quite interesting as I was preparing for this at the New York Times just yesterday. No, this was 2 days ago. I'm sorry, it was Friday. I just saw it yesterday. It says, "Feeling hopeless, embrace it." And it's by Eric Utne. Some of you may remember the Utne Reader or something. I think, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, UTNE. This was a magazine that he produced some years ago. I don't know if it's even still out there. But it's an interesting editorial and opinion piece on hope and what does hope really mean here. And we're going to get into a bit of a discussion of this. But he even quotes Extinction Rebellion. Some of you may have heard of Extinction Rebellion. This is a branch of environmental activism that's going on in the world right now. It's involved in the US, but it's also around the world. And their central message is, hope dies, action begins. And I think we have to, once more, we're going to get into this as we look at what Joanna Macy says about hope. We really have to get away from this idea of hope being, oh, if we just get another president, everything will be fine. Or if we just get, this to happen, then it'll all be fine. That's the kind of hope that I think is disastrous for us, because it's not recognizing the complexity and the interdependence of everything that's happening in our world. If we somehow think that someone's going to fly in and the aliens are going to land and suddenly take over the world and we're all going to be fine, or whatever people believe might happen, that might be a little preposterous. But nonetheless, we tend to put our hope somewhere else and think, oh, if this were to happen, if that were to happen, then it would all reverse itself. It would all be fine. We're even doing that to some degree with the COVID-19 pandemic. People are putting all their hope on, this vaccine and everything going back to normal to some degree. Well, again, I think that can be a disastrous thing for people to just sign up for that. I mean, we need to have some hopefulness, but that hopefulness needs to be grounded in action, grounded in doing what needs to be done. So again, Extinction Rebellion says hope dies, action begins. I don't have a problem with it when you think of hope in that way, because I think it is good for people to not have that kind of misplaced hope. That is simply thinking that everything is going to be taken care of. And we may still end up dealing with lots of consequential, substantial results from everything that has happened in terms of the environment. And we may not be able to reverse a lot of what has transpired. Obviously, many species are already going extinct. They've gone extinct. We can't bring them back. That's not something that we're capable of doing. So we do have to deal with the reality that hope is sometimes a bit misplaced. But active hope, I think, is a different story. So let's take a look at what is said about this. And again, why I share this concept is because I think it's so useful. I found it useful in my own life. They say in their book, whatever situation we face, we can choose our response. Of course, this is one of the most amazing things. Viktor Frankl, who was the Auschwitz survivor, talked about this being humankind's one freedom, is that we always can choose our response in regard to anything we face. Even as he faced years in the concentration camps, he could still choose how he was going to deal with that. So they say, when facing overwhelming challenges, we might feel that our actions don't count for much. And I think that this is part of what drives people sometimes into a bit of despair, is because they think, oh, what do my actions matter? So I recycle my plastic. What effect is that really having? Yet the kind of responses we make and the degree to which we believe they count are shaped by the way we think and feel about hope. The word hope has two different meanings, they say. The first involves hopefulness, where our preferred outcome seems reasonably likely to happen. If we require this kind of hope before we commit ourselves to an action, our response gets blocked in areas where we don't rate our chances too high. So I think people can understand what they're saying here in regard to that angle of hope, where we put our hope in something with the aim that it will actually come to pass. Well, if we require that before we commit ourselves, that could be a real problem, especially when we look at the immensity of the problems that we're dealing with in our world right now. The second meaning is about desire or aspiration. It is this kind of hope that starts our journey, knowing what we hope for and what we'd like or love to take place. It is what we do with this hope that really makes the difference. So what they're getting at here with this idea of hope, in my estimation, again, it's this thought again connected to the heart that is our intention to move in a particular direction. That is not so, caught up in, is the result attainable? Is it possible to reverse everything that has been done in regard to climate change and so on? It's committed to the path, whether or not that is going to happen, because we see that it's the right thing to do. It's what we feel compelled to do. It's a very different form of hope, and it does involve action, obviously, on top of it, but it is a very different way of going about one's actions and intentions. So hope is definitely not the same thing, should they say. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a quote from someone else. I found this quote through one of those articles that I found recently online. This is Václav Havel, who was a playwright who was, I guess, the leader of the Czech Republic many years ago. This goes back to 1993. When I found this, I was quite amazed. This was alluded to in that opinion piece that I read earlier from Eric Utny. It says, hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense. By the way, that hyphen shouldn't be there. I was trying to fit it all onto one page and somehow that got stuck in there. So the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. It is this hope, above all, that gives us strength to live and to continually try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now. So he was writing this in 1993. My gosh, you could translate that to today and what's going on in our world, climate-wise, environmentally, as well as what's happening with the pandemic. So once more, it's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, that it is the right thing to do, that it is the proper thing to do, that it is what we are compelled to do. Which again, in Buddhism, we already talked about that. What we're compelled to do is to wake ourselves up with pure wisdom and to act out of genuine compassion and concern, knowing that everything does matter. Everything absolutely matters. So back to the book Active Hope, they also delineate in terms of how they come up with this idea of what active hope is. They contrast it to passive hope, which is what I was referring to earlier. Passive hope is about waiting for external agencies to bring about what we desire. If we elect the right people in, well, then they're going to take care of it. They'll all get together and do the new Green Deal and it'll all be over. I won't even have to worry about it anymore. I'm not saying don't get people in office that are concerned about the environment, what have you, but don't put all of your eggs in that basket. Put your eggs in the basket as well of active hope. Active hope is about becoming active participants in bringing about what we hope for, whether or not it materializes. Active hope is a practice, like Tai Chi or gardening. It is something we do rather than have. It is a process we can apply to any situation, and it involves 3 steps. So again, why I'm introducing this is because I think it's such a valuable way of framing everything else I've talked about already today in terms of the Buddhist teachings and how we bring them into the world. If we bring them in with this mindset of active hope, I think it can be very powerful and we can make a big difference in the world. First, we take a clear view of reality. So we've already talked about that to some degree, right? We do need to be in touch with what's really happening. And that was part of why I shared some of those statistics that might be a bit alarming to hear, to see what's happening. I don't know, I'm assuming the statistics are up to date. I'm not sure with our government currently whether they have been kept up to date, but they are up from what I did a year ago, a little over a year ago when I first presented those. So again, we do see that having the facts is really important. Being aware and understanding what is actually going on is an important part of it. And of course, this is playing out again, not just in terms of the world environment and what have you. It's even playing out in terms of social justice issues in our world and what have you. To have good awareness and understanding, knowledge of what is all happening. So we have to have that clear view of reality. Second, we identify what we hope for in terms of the direction we'd like things to move in, or the values we'd like to see expressed. So again, I don't feel like Buddhism has a monopoly on this, but certainly Buddhism has ideas about what we would like to ideally have happen for beings, is for them to not suffer in terms of the world that they're in now and the temporal experience they're having, but eventually to be free from everything that leads to suffering, dissatisfaction, and what have you. Buddhism has a lot in terms of what we are hoping for. But even when it comes to more immediate goals that we're trying to aim for, those are motivated in that way. They're within the sphere of bodhicitta motivation, that compassionate wish to benefit others and so on. But nonetheless, this is a second step, is that we have to kind of identify what it is that we are wanting to aim for, that we are the direction that we'd like things to move in. Again, regardless of whether we can actually get it to that destination, that's an important part of the process, is to make sure that we're aiming in the right direction. Third, we take steps to move ourselves or our situation in that direction. We try to line up with that deeper intention and motivation. So these are the 3 steps of active hope: having that clear view of reality, determine what direction you'd like things to move in, and then align yourself with that. Take steps so that you can be a part of the force moving us in that direction. So since active hope doesn't require our optimism, remember we talked about that earlier, even that quote from Václav Havel, he said, that optimism shouldn't be involved in our hope. We shouldn't feel like we have to get the result that we are seeking. He says, we can apply it even in areas where we feel hopeless. It's kind of interesting. You can have active hope when you're hopeless. We can have that mindset even if we're not optimistic about the outcome. Even if we do get to that tipping point where we have gone beyond where we can actually reverse things in this world, it shouldn't stop us from wanting to move in that direction. What good would that do? The guiding impetus is intention, they say. We choose what we aim to bring about, act for, and express. Rather than weighing our chances and proceeding only when we feel hopeful, we focus on our intention and let it be our guide. So this is starting to move into this, once more, this direction that I think Buddhism has a pretty good handle on in terms of intention, motivation. But we have to have some way of framing this, some way of seeing this so that we are not going to end up hopeless and despairing and thinking, it's just pointless for us to continue to put any effort in it. But rather, we continue to feel motivated in that way. We continue to feel that force moving us forward in what direction we've chosen, regardless of whether the actual result is attainable or not. I mean, it might sound kind of crazy in some regard in worldly terms, but this is what we're here to do, is just to keep that intention moving in the right direction, with the recognition that we will do what needs to be done in the moment. Whether it has the effect that we hope for it to have, it's not so important. It's the intention to move forward in that direction. Staying true to that is so important. So let's go on then to, this is where I hope that this is a useful part of this. I found it quite useful. But when we start talking about intention, as I said, we have to kind of couch this within some picture of what it is that's going on, what it is that we're buying into, how we're looking at our situation. I found this quite useful in terms of what they call these 3 stories of our time. And each of these stories present a different way of kind of examining, or we're looking at the situation that we're facing in terms of climate change and species extinction and all the various things that are happening. So let's take a look at these, and I hope that you can find this useful. They say, we describe three stories or versions of reality, each acting as a lens through which we see and understand what's going on. So once more, because why we're going into this is because this is what guides our intention. How you choose to see the world is what guides your intention. In Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism, how do we see the world? In terms of the Four Noble Truths, we kind of have an understanding of what our situation is, how it could be different. In terms of the Mahayana teachings, it's the idea that all beings, ourselves included, have the potential to develop ourselves completely to Buddhahood. So we see that that's the story, if you will. And of course, we have great confidence that that story is not just a story, it's actually the reality that we all have the potential to do that. We then develop bodhicitta, our intention, within that story. Within that, again, context, that this is why we cultivate the mind of bodhicitta, is because it makes sense within the concept of us being able to develop our own minds to Buddhahood, and in the state of Buddhahood, be able to help others to do the same work. So we need a story in a sense, and I'm not using story there, again, in a demeaning way. I think stories are very powerful ways that we frame what we're doing, that we look at what's happening in the world, and then we can have an impetus to move within that story. Some of these stories are not as beneficial as others from some perspectives, but nonetheless, we can examine each of these three stories and see to what degree we've bought into these stories in our own evolution. The very first story is called business as usual. It's kind of the status quo, things just continuing to happen the way they are. The second one is the great unraveling. Of course, this is what a lot of us, when we first started hearing all the news of climate change and things happening in the world, when we first saw an inconvenient truth and all these things that were trying to wake us to what was going on, is kind of thinking, it's all falling apart. It's all just, this is the end. It's Armageddon. Then we have the great turning, which, as we'll see, is an alternative to the two of those, and is perhaps the best way to go about creating this active hope within the context of this story. So let's take a look at these a little bit more deeply. In the first of these, business as usual, the defining assumption is that there's little need to change the way we live. Economic growth is regarded as essential for prosperity, and the central plot is about getting ahead. I mean, I'm not trying to be critical of anyone by saying this, but we can see even in our dealing with this pandemic, how business as usual has been a response. It's been a story that people want to tell in the midst of this, that we just need to keep plowing forward and doing what we're doing and don't worry about the pandemic. It'll take care of itself, and what have you. Well, it's a story. It's not a story that perhaps lends itself to the best results, but nonetheless, it's what some people are buying into. And certainly historically, many people have bought into that in regard to climate change. Just kind of saying, we don't even know if it's human caused. We don't even know all these various things. And so they've just plowed forward thinking, we just keep doing what we're doing. There's no need to really change anything. So the governing principles that are behind business as usual are: economic growth is essential for prosperity. Nature is a commodity to be used for human purposes. Promoting consumption is good for the economy. We need to keep that gross national product growing. Everybody keep buying things, doing all this stuff. The central plot is about getting ahead. The problems of other peoples, nations, and species are not our concern. The America First kind of idea that's been batted around by some people. These are the core assumptions of business as usual. It's a story. It's a way of framing things so that people then live their lives according to that, and they follow these core assumptions. Let's go on to the second story. The second story, again, is a bit of a depressing one, but it's the great unraveling. It draws attention to the disasters that business as usual is taking us toward, as well as those it has already brought about. It is an account backed by evidence of the collapse of ecological and social systems, the disturbance of climate, the depletion of resources, and the mass extinction of species. It's kind of depressing. I remember when the last white rhinoceros died, it was, what do we care about white rhinoceri in this world? Well, they should be in this world. I mean, it's only through our mismanaging of this planet that these species have gone out of existence, that they are extinct. There are so many things going on in our world that can be really depressing to see. And it's very easy to buy into the story of the great unraveling, to think that this is it. This is the end of humanity as we know it. I've even heard that with regard to the pandemic, people saying, oh, this is it. Well, the great unraveling of the early 21st century involves the following. It's the economic decline, that has occurred. Nations not growing as quickly as what they were before, the resource depletion that is happening, climate change, social division and war, mass extinction of species. Again, these are the sorts of things that can feed into that story when we only focus on the negative side of it and don't cultivate this active hope. The third story, the Great Turning, is held and embodied by those who know the first story is leading us to catastrophe and who refuse to let the second story have the last word. Where it's not going to be the great unraveling. That's not going to be what this is all about. It's going to be about something different. So, involving the emergence of new and creative human responses, it is about the epochal transition from an industrial society committed to economic growth to a life-sustaining society committed to the healing and recovery of our world. And I want to make Joanna Macy in charge of all of this, but then that gets to be a bit of that putting my hope in someone else. But she has an amazing vision and a view of what is the mindset, the story that will get us out of this, is the move from what we have been doing and the way that society has been built over the last several centuries to a life-sustaining society that will be dedicated to helping the planet to heal and all the beings in it to be, find a new way of living their lives. And they say we call this story the Great Turning. The central plot is finding and offering our gift of active hope. So we're going to go a little bit more into the Great Turning and kind of what's involved in it, but the essence of it is this idea that we can look at what's going on in the world right now, and again, be it the pandemic or be it the climate change and all the other things that are happening with the environment, and we can once more see that this is an opportunity. This is an amazing, window opening for us as a species to move in a different direction. And I like this story. I mean, I'm still a bit flummoxed sometimes in terms of, liking it and acting in regard to it. It still seems like, where is it all going? How are we going to get there? But I like that more people are buying into this story. I even saw a wonderful little video I thought about sharing, and it's about 5 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube. It's called The Great Realization. That was made in Britain, so it's got a Z, I'm sorry, S instead of the Z in realization. But anyway, this video, The Great Realization, was made by this British guy, and he's like telling a nighttime story to his children. And it's, of course, long past 2020, and he's talking back about, in retrospect, what happened in 2020 when this great pandemic came, and then after we got the cure and everybody was back out in the world, how they lived their life differently. I mean, what a wonderful thought that if we could take this opportunity of what's all transpired in this world and make it into something else when we come out the other end, so that it isn't a continuation of the same stuff that got us into this. There is that phrase that I don't know who it's actually, accurately attributed to. I've seen everyone from Ben Franklin to I don't know who else, but insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, humanity has been insane, continuing to do the same sorts of things and expecting that somehow it's all going to work out. Well, we have to do something different. The Great Turning is the story that embodies that difference, that move in a different direction, away from what we have been doing that has not really done the trick. It's actually gotten us deeper into trouble, and move towards something that would be more life-sustaining and more embracing of the sacredness of this world and all the beings in it. Again, totally in line with Buddhist concepts, totally in line with, it's not to say that once more we're going to completely fix the world. Buddhism knows better than to say that, because the world out there that is conditioned by all of our karma and delusions and so on isn't going to completely change, but it can become a very different story. It can become a very different thing that we're experiencing. So again, I really like their way of phrasing all this, putting it all together in terms of the contrast of this story, where active hope is the main central plot of all of this, in the context of the other two, the business as usual and the great, what was it called, the huge unraveling, everything falling apart. So, whoops, Joanna Macy says, there is no point in arguing about which of these three stories is right. All three are happening. Everyone's buying into their own story depending upon what their own mindset is. She says the question is which one we want to put our energy behind. Again, when we talk about this idea of the human heart, which one is most in line with the potential of the human heart? Which one actually speaks to how we make that flower and blossom and bloom in the midst of everything that we're going through? Future generations will look back at the time we are living in now, the kind of future they look from, and the story they tell about our period will be shaped by choices we make in our lifetimes, how we choose to see our situation and the world that we're living in. Rather than continuing to buy into stories that haven't been so effective in our world, that actually have not been productive in terms of producing what it is that we want to experience. The most telling choice of all may well be the story we live from and see ourselves participating in. It sets the context of our lives in a way that influences all other decisions. Again, I've pretty much said that. Just put them in the slides so I make sure I don't miss points. In choosing our story, we not only cast our vote of influence over the kind of the world future generations inherit, but we also affect our own lives in the here and now. When we find a good story and fully give ourselves to it, that story can act through us, breathing new life into everything we do. When we move in a direction that touches our heart, we add to the momentum of deeper purpose that makes us feel more alive. A great story and a satisfying life share a vital element, a compelling plot that moves toward meaningful goals, where what is at stake is far larger than our personal gains and losses. So again, they call the Great Turning such a story, and they really say that again, if we move in this direction so that we are supporting kind of a different direction for humanity to take, that in and of itself has great meaning and purpose. That is what active hope looks like, is that we know that there is a better way that we would like to see humanity move. Whether it will eventually get there or not is not as important as whether we put the energy into doing that, making our lives fulfilling, making our actions most powerful. So let me just touch on a few of the elements that are in there. I had some slides for this, but I think I'll leave the rest of the slides for now. But essentially, when they talk about the Great Turning, they're talking about kind of three levels of action that are involved in that. The first one are the holding actions, which means kind of keeping things from getting worse. This is what a lot of people are engaged in already, is holding actions. Okay, I'll stop doing this. I'll stop buying plastic bottles with water in them, so that I can actually use filtered water or some way of keeping water in my house without having to create all that plastic that is so detrimental to the environment and so on. Holding actions are essential. They save lives. They are a necessary part of it. The second dimension that she talks about in terms of the Great Turning is life-sustaining systems and practices, to kind of adopt things that help us to move in a more positive direction. This means finding, and embracing sustainable sources of, energy, renewable energy, doing what we can to add other things to our sustaining of life so that we can actually continue to have resources on this planet for all the beings on this planet. Those life-sustaining actions are the complement to the holding actions. But everything generally for people starts with the holding actions, and then they begin to adopt perhaps the life-sustaining systems and practices. The third dimension, though, is the one that, again, I think that Buddhism has a lot to offer and that each of us can be a part of, is sort of the shift in consciousness that happens. And this is where she goes into great detail in the book. And she even has a wonderful video herself, Joanna Macy, about this idea of the Shambhala myth, the Shambhala warrior that's talked about in Tibetan Buddhism. These great bodhisattvas that appear at these times when the earth is in such, detrimental, dangerous sorts of places. And it is like the heroic being that is there to help address this and to work with that. This is a whole change in consciousness that I think we all have to embrace, that we're going to try to, as we move out of this pandemic, whenever that happens, that will there be something on the other side that is, as was called in that other video, the great realization? Will people have a shift in their awareness so that we can actually see that what has transpired in our world has impacted us at a deeper level? Now, again, I don't have the greatest confidence in this because I see what's even happened during this pandemic, at least in the US, as things began to open up. Of course, maybe we didn't have enough time in our little caves, in our little retreat huts where we could meditate on things and see things a bit more clearly. But nonetheless, you start opening up the doors again, and it's back to business as usual, right? The great turning is no longer embraced as the idea. Maybe a few people had that thought while they were in, quarantine and in seclusion and what have you. And then we come back out and we go, oh, let's go back to business as usual. Let's do everything the way we did it before. An essential part of the great turning is this shift in consciousness, this shift in awareness, where we say, what we were doing and the way we were thinking of things and how we were going about things isn't going to work anymore. We have to come up with a different way of looking at things. I'm still holding out some hope. Again, it might be this active hope that isn't so invested necessarily in the result, but the idea that this is an important part of human evolution. This is the evolution of the human heart, where we are able to embrace the entire planet within the scope of it, which of course is what Buddhism is always speaking to. Not excluding anyone from that, but understanding that we have to take care of everyone, or we're not taking care of anyone, essentially. This shift in consciousness, I think, is once more going to be the main impetus for what all transpires, all the actions that come from this. If we actually have governments and people on the streets and people doing what needs to be done to help make sure that we don't go back to paradigms that were not so useful for us. I mean, even if we look at what's happening in terms of this country, I'm not going to get into a whole debate about it because I know there are a wide array of views. But if we look at what's happening around policing in this country and social injustice, especially towards African Americans in our society, though obviously it goes beyond that, you know, why not find a new way to look at this? Why not break the paradigm of what the police force has become in many parts of our country and look at it taking on a different dimension, incorporating other elements for mental health and other things that need to be done that unfortunately police have had to deal with, and they may not have been the best people to handle some of what they've had to deal with. We get so afraid to kind of tear it all apart so we can build it up into something better, because everyone thinks that they're going to lose something by virtue of that. Well, what if we gain something by virtue of that? That's what this shift in consciousness is about, is to say that we actually could come out on the other side of this much better if we attend to all of this, if we actually stay in touch with our hearts, if we are grounded in wisdom and compassion, motivated by that active hope that is going to be true to the principles that we feel are important in this world. So maybe that's enough of me going blah, 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 especially since I'm pretty close to my end of my time. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share in regard to this? I'm not the keeper of all the wisdom here, by any means, and I'm fairly ignorant when it comes to a lot of this stuff around climate change. But speaking from my vantage point as a Buddhist teacher, I think that these are things that we should be entertaining. The whole idea that this could be something to really help us move as a species and as a planet into a different dimension, a different phase. Vicky says, since the power of corporations has reached a level never before seen in human history, and assuming that the system can't be crushed in the near future, in a conventional sense, we are pretty much powerless. Well, there is that truth to it, in America in particular, where corporate interests have taken over to a larger degree. And even when we look at the way our government operates in terms of lobbying and the power of those corporations in that setting, it is a bit limiting. But I guess, again, we don't want to be bound by that, but rather, once more, look to it from the point of view of what is it that I'm motivated to do? What is it that makes sense for me, that I feel is the right dimension to move in, the right direction to move in? And stay committed to that, regardless of what's going on. And if we can make some difference in terms of the people that we elect, the ideas that they bring to government, then by all means, put our energies into doing those things as well. Part of what I was going to go into for the remainder of the lecture was some of the things that we can actually do. Also, make choices about which corporations we support then. If you have corporations that we feel are not being the best friend to the planet and the beings on the planet, well, then do your best to, individually divest of those, to not support them through the products that they produce and what have you. There's great power in terms of movements within the populace. We can make a huge difference. I mean, look at what Mahatma Gandhi was able to do to the British in India, through the force of a nonviolent revolution. And these things like Extinction Rebellion that I mentioned earlier, they're a nonviolent group as well. They're adhering to nonviolence as a means of creating some change in society. So yes, we have a lot of things stacked against us. I agree, Vicky, but I wouldn't let that become a a great unraveling kind of point for you, where you kind of go, oh well, then we just have to resign ourselves to that because that's what we have to deal with. That's what we've created. What has been created by human beings can be uncreated by them, and something new can be created by them. I have great confidence that this can happen. I think it just takes a lot of people buying into it. Marianne, thank you for having the courage to speak out about what's going on the police and stuff. Oh, you're welcome. I, I wish I was more active physically. I mean, I find that my schedule, especially now that I'm teaching online and doing these PowerPoints and all this stuff, it gets to be very full. I don't have so much time to go running down to the roundhouse, as they call it here, the state capitol, and be parts of protests and what have you. But I think it is really important that we see that all of this is producing, to some degree, the momentum for some shift in our world. Let's take advantage of it. Let's not go back to, what it was before. I think, this idea of returning to normal, back to normal, isn't the most healthiest idea. We need to kind of look at this and see, how do we do things now? How do we make sure that people, aren't left by the wayside when something like this comes along again, that they, are taken care of and what have you? Anthony says, indeed, the consumers have power, but I suppose we need to focus on our intention first. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that this is where it all starts. That's why, again, the primary motivation that we always see is get our own minds in the right direction. And then our actions hopefully follow from that. Uber had to replace their president, and I know Goya is having issues, not necessarily related to ecology, but they demonstrate the power of consumers and individuals. I think we have a lot of more power. One of the most inspiring things that I listen to it occasionally because it really does kind of get me going in that uh, political kind of vent is Patti Smith sang with the Choir. Have you heard of Choir? The two guys out of Toronto that go around and they set up these things where people arrive at a location and they sing a song that they've all been given the lyrics to, and this choir master, who's one of the two guys, he leads them all in learning their parts, and then they often have a guest singer, and in this case they brought in Patti Smith, and she sang her song "People Have the Power." If you want to watch that on YouTube, it'll really give you a lift. Patti Smith and Choir. And I don't know, I mean, I think we do have the power. Yes, our officials and corporations and all this have some power as well. We're not denying that. But we actually, they are there representing us, and the corporations are supported by us. Look at how much impetus there was from the corporations to get everybody back to work. Why? Because they depend upon people. If the people aren't there, they don't have what they want. So the heads of corporations, all of that, we need to see that it's an interdependent phenomenon. We can't, neglect that we're also a very important part of that and a much larger part of that. Sending petitions are very helpful, especially within animal rights. Yeah, I mean, I think these are important things to do, but I think it's also the hitting the streets that's so important, as we're seeing now in Portland, where the the moms were gathering as the front line, and now you've got the veterans as the front line, defending the protesters from the federal forces and what have you. I mean, it's important to have the bodies there too, but absolutely do what we can. Everything is important. And that's the one thing I like about Joanna Macy and Chris Johnson's book, is that they don't point out and say, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. And I'm hoping you're not getting that from what I'm saying today. Each of us has to find where our own little niche is, where our own little comfort zone is, what it is that we feel we can contribute. For some of us, it's mostly holding actions, like I said. That's great. Do your holding actions, do them happily, do them with your bodhicitta motivation. Know that every time that you refrain from buying a plastic bottle, you're helping other beings on this planet, and rejoice in that. Um, this Graciela says, this is so inspiring and helpful. Well, good, but I need to take action in ways that I have not before. Otherwise, nothing may happen. I think that this is true. We are sometimes asked to go beyond our comfort zone. And I'm hoping you're getting a little bit of that too today. I don't want people just to say, well, pat yourself on the back for the things you are doing and just become complacent. No, I think each of us have to go, what's the next step? How do I take it a little bit further? How do I make sure that the actions I'm engaging in and the mindset that I bring to them are continuing to develop myself? Um, Good. I'm glad I'm giving you hope by saying we have the power. Yeah. I think we do, you know. And so anyway, maybe I should play that video at the end. I don't know if there's a vote for that. I'm happy to put it on. It's really, really pretty amazing. If you'd like to see it, I will go ahead and get it queued up. Maybe we'll do our dedication and then I'll play it for you. Those of you who would like to stay can stay and do that. I have it already as one of my things that I can pull up really, really quickly. So let me, okay, it's gonna be coming on when we're ready for that to happen. So let me come back to the Zoom meeting. All right, let's do our dedication prayers. Oh, Francis, you have your hand raised. You want to share something?
No, I just want to watch the video, like I was saying.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
All right, well, let's just do, well, actually, if everybody wants to watch the video, I mean, if you don't want to watch the video, maybe quietly dedicate to yourself and then you can be on your way, but let's watch it. It's not that very long. I think it's like 5-6 minutes, something like that. So let me do the share screen, and I'm also going to have to set up the shared audio so that comes through. Otherwise, there's not a lot of point. So we do the shared computer sound, and let's go for it.
Okay, let's see if we can get this one. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
I was dreaming in my dreaming. Well, of an aspect bright and fair, and my sleeping, it was broken, but my dream, it lingered near, in the farm of shining valleys, where the pure air rarefied, and my senses are newly opened. I awaken into the cry that the people have the power to redeem the work of fools upon the meek. The grace is showered, it's decreed, the people rule. People have the power. People have the power. People have the power. People have the power. Believe it. Aspects became suspect and bending low as if to hear, and the armies ceased advancing because the people had their ear, and the shepherds and the soldiers, well, they laid beneath the stars, exchanging visions, laying arms to waste in the dust, in the form of shining valleys, where the pure air rarefied, and the senses reopened, awakened to the cry. People have the power.
both there. So, okay. Great. I hope you enjoyed that. I think people did, from what I was seeing, people putting yes in the box there. So anyway, good. So let's dedicate all that positive energy. And again, think about in conclusion, what you might do from this. What does your great turning look like? What does this look like for you in the future? And just keep that energy moving forward, because the world needs it. Let me do the share screen for the prayer that we've been doing on Sundays, this dedication that is the Master Shanti Deva's wonderful verses. So let's recite this together, bringing to mind all those beings that we're dedicating for, as well as the entire world, all the beings in it, so that there may be the greatest benefit possible from what we've done here today. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And lastly, we dedicate for our precious teachers, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who, as I mentioned earlier, is such a beacon in our times, especially around the environment and all the beings in this world. Just make strong prayers and dedications for His Holiness to have good health and a long life, to continue to be with us many, many, many more years. Also the same for Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, as well as all the other spiritual guides in this world, who are so central to helping others to advance in the ways that we're talking about today, to continue to keep their heart open and do the work that needs to be done. So thank you all so much. I enjoyed this very much today. It's a nice topic to be working with, and to bring in some of these other things that are going on in our world too. I hope that was useful, to see that it's all part of the same thing. This is the world we live in. This is what we have to work with. So again, do the work that you need to do. I congratulate you on what you already are doing, and keep it moving forward. So, all right. Thank you all so much.